I'm going to be painting this wintry, gray, foggy scene from Greenland. We've got this bright red cabin kind of in the mid-ground off to the right, and I want to make that kind of a central feature of the painting. I want that red to really pop out. And what I'm going to do first, I already have some of the color mixed. It's kind of a light, cool gray. And that's because we have little patches of snow, but the snow isn't actually white, even though you might think it's white. It's actually slightly gray because of the overcast sky. So in order to get that light gray to be the lightest color instead of white, I need to get rid of the white on the paper. And it's just going to be a very light wash. So let's get started here. Yeah, I'm going to come back and do the sky later. Yeah, that's perfect. I tried to do this painting yesterday, and I made the snow way too dark. It just didn't look like snow. So, lesson learned for this time. Go with a lighter gray. A light, cool gray. So I'm just going to cover the entire paper in this gray color. I will probably add a little warmth as it comes down. Just using ultramarine blue and cobalt blue, burnt sienna, or burnt umber, raw sienna, burnt umber. Yeah, and I want these distant mountains to be more bluish, generally speaking. That will give the impression that they're farther away. That's one of the ways that we can create the illusion of distance, is by making things that are farther away more blue tinted. All that light has to go through more atmosphere to reach your eyes from the thing you're looking at, the farther away it is, so the bluer it gets. My friend actually took this picture on her trip to Greenland earlier this year. I think it was this year. It seems like a pretty stunning place. It's not somewhere I ever considered visiting, but staring at this picture for so long kind of makes me want to visit. It looks just stunning. Kind of like Alaska, just more barren. Just getting rid of that little ridge, or trying to. By spraying the back side of the paper, trying to get it to flatten out. So I'm coming towards this cabin. I'm gonna switch to a smaller brush real quick. I was using this flat brush before for big shapes and details. I'm just gonna mix that red in with a little bit of the gray to darken it a little bit. I'm going to use very thick pigment so that it pops out right away in the first wash. And there's some fine white lines that run along the house, and I might come back later with gouache at the very end and get those. Maybe, if I feel like it needs it. It might not. Let me get rid of that red. I'm not going to need that. again. Actually, I might, but I'll put it back later. Only have so much space on my small palette here. So just gradually adding more warm into this gray as I come down closer to the viewer. And that's a way you can make things appear closer, is by warming them up as they get closer. And I'm painting right over all these patches of snow. None of the snow is going to be white. There's a few tiny incidental highlights here and there where the white of the paper is showing through, but those are just there to add a little bit of a randomness. Helps the painting look more vibrant and alive. You see that red is kind of bleeding off into the sides. That's exactly what I want it to happen. It gives it this glowing, magical, ethereal look. Same thing's happening up here at the top of the ridge, but this is going to mostly get covered up by when I paint the sky in just a minute. Okay, time to paint this sky. So I'm actually going to drop in right here. There's a glow from the sun up here as well, kind of along the ridge line. There's a glow coming out from the sun above the clouds. It's pretty subtle in the picture, but I want to make it a little more prominent, a little more exaggerated for the painting. I think it'll be a really nice touch. So let's see what this looks like. And I'm just exaggerating it a little bit. I'm not going crazy. I'm just gonna drop in a little yellow ochre. Right there. Right along the top of the ridge where the light's peeking over. And then up here. My goal is to create a glowing effect. That's what I'm trying to do here. And yeah, so the top of that ridge is going to be a little fuzzy. So that gives the impression of a bit of mist or clouds up there. Just adds to the mood. It's a very moody painting. Very, very moody. Because it's a moody picture, and I'm trying to convey that moodiness, that dark, grim, stark, cold Greenland. It's amazing to think that people actually live there. They've lived there for thousands of years. So just mixing a cool gray for the sky. Maybe warm it up a little bit, actually. So I'm going to come touch that into the top of this yellow. And you see how that immediately made a perfect gradient. It's a very short gradient, but it's a perfect gradient because watercolor can actually mix on the paper. That's one of the reasons it looks the way it does. It has this ability for the pigments to flow into each other and blend together and kind of create their own little nuance and flavors and textures, and there's always these unexpected, interesting things that happen that you have no control over and no way to predict. There's a certain randomness to it that's exciting and beautiful and just makes it look alive and vibrant. I'm a big fan, if you can't tell. I actually only started painting in 2019 because that's when I graduated school and I found myself with a bunch of free time. So I decided I would finally learn how to paint. And I eventually ended up on watercolor after trying out a few different things and realizing that I didn't even know how to draw and I should probably figure that out first. And so I started doing line and wash sketches, which I'll probably do more of those at some point on this channel. Let me know if you're interested in that kind of thing. Okay, I'm trying to get this to be a little smoother. The glow is a little too much. So what I think I'm going to do is just add some of this gray right into the yellow. Just kind of glaze over it, and that should dim it down a little bit. Yeah, that looks better. It was just a little too exaggerated. Now, you do have to keep in mind this is all going to dry several shades lighter than it is now. Watercolor does that. It dries lighter than when you put it on the paper. So you have to make things a little darker than they're going to end up when you first put the paint down. That is a very difficult thing to get used to, but it just takes practice. Yeah, it still looks funny. So I'm just gonna do that. Just kind of cover up some of these other areas. Yeah, that's better. I think that's what I want. Now these mountains are going to be very dark. Way darker than this. Remember, this is the lightest color on the painting. And basically what I'm going to do is paint all the dark areas in and paint around the patches of snow and leave those as this light gray color. And then when you see how dark the paint is going to get, it will make sense why this is the lightest color. This is so that I can convey that dark, moody atmosphere by kind of bringing the brightest color way down, and then everything else will be relative to that, and it will still look like a good painting, hopefully. So I'm going to let this dry for a few minutes and then I'll be right back. All right, let's see. Just lightly touching it with the back of my hand. Still pretty wet, but I think we're gonna be all right. So I need this to be relatively dry so that when I put in the darker areas, it doesn't bleed all over the place, because I want there to be these really sharp edges between basically where the snow is laying on the ground. And if the paper is wet and you put more paint onto it, it's going to bloom and bleed, which is exactly what I did all in the first wash. The paper was actually slightly wet. It's called wet into wet technique, actually. And I'm looking for more wet on dry. All right, we're gonna start from the bottom and work up so that the sky also has time to dry. I need the sky to be dry so that when I paint the top of the mountain, it gives me a sharp line. If I drop paint in here now, it's gonna start blooming. It might be cool to let it bloom just a little bit though, we'll see. So I'm going to go much darker than the first wash. There's all kinds of, looks like dead grass and lichen and snow. This painting is going to be very texture oriented, kind of abstract, because that's how the landscape looks to me. Just making sure that that's actually dry enough. Yeah, I think that's all right. Man, I really hope that this looks like snow. So this, which is the second wash, so first wash, putting down your lightest values, basically the light colors that are going to show through underneath the darker layers you put on top. There's a little red right here. So I'm trying to pay attention to all these subtle variations in color. That's going to add a lot of interest and movement. So this wash is for the middle values. The big middle value shape that ties the whole painting together. And then there's going to be a third wash where I add the darkest darks where I think it needs it. And I'm already kind of planning ahead as to where that's going to happen. Alright, I'm going to add this dead grass. It's kind of a pale yellow-green something or other. I might exaggerate the greenness of it just to add a little bit of more life to the painting. So I'm being very mindful and careful to paint around these patches of snow so that they look like the lightest thing in the painting, and I'm hoping that the context will tell you that that's snow when you see it on the mountains, and I think it'll all tie together, but it won't look like snow until the very end when I put the darkest darks on, is my prediction. And that's how watercolor goes. It's very much delayed gratification with this medium. It takes a lot of effort and work to get to the end of the painting where everything actually looks like a painting, but it's very worth it. It's very satisfying, I think. And here's a good example of contrast between wet into wet and wet on dry. So within this middle value shape that I'm painting, there's areas where the colors blend into each other, like right here between that gray and that green, same here. So if you follow just this shape, all of these colors are blending into each other, same way that they are in the first wash. But then if you look at these sharp edges between the snow and the middle value, that's where you get that wet on dry, razor sharp edge. So in watercolor, you can get both of those things. You can get the flowing, soft, wet into wet, and then you can also get the razor sharp edges with wet on dry. I should mention I'm mixing this green. So I mix the green first by taking that yellow and this ultramarine blue, and then I mix that green into this light blue-gray color that's already on the palette, which is left over from the first wash. And that dulls the green down a little bit, because if I were to just put that straight up green, freshly mixed green on top of this gray painting, it would kind of stand out. It would look weird. It just wouldn't look like it fit. So that's a way to add cohesion to the colors, is to mix the colors you're using into what's already on the palette. Okay, I'm just slowly working my way back, paying attention to how the colors change as we do, trying to stay true to the painting, or trying to stay true to the photo, while also reinterpreting it as a painting and not exactly copying it. It's a delicate balance. Especially since this picture is, I should say this, I'm making this painting for a friend. This was a place that she'd been, so I'm trying to stay true to that. And basically trying to do it justice as best I can. I mean, this place is just spectacular, so I can only hope to come close. Yeah, there's all this like dead grass that goes up the mountainside back here. It's this dull yellow, red, rusty color. It's yellow, red, and rusty all at the same time. And there's this kind of river of snow that goes up the mountain. And that's going to be a key feature of the painting. Your eye is going to follow that. At least that's what I want to happen. So I need that to stand out. And I'm creating some dry brush texture by just quickly dragging my brush along the paper and letting it skip. I'm using Arches cold press rough, so the paper already has a bit of texture in it, which is what I like. Not too rough, but just a little grit makes doing dry brush way easier for me. So yeah, just trying to get the basic idea of the shape of this river of snow here. I am kind of painting along the contours of the ground. I'm following with my brush what the ground is actually doing, which does make a big difference. It gives a sense of motion, because you're literally painting the direction of the ground with your brush. Just those little details that make big differences. Okay. More of this dead grass color on this side. Might make this a little more red. Just a little. Because there's a slight red tinge to it in the picture. And I'll add more of those subtle interesting variations that make the painting look alive. Many of these areas I'm painting now are going to get even darker in the final wash. And that's, I'm hoping, is what is going to make that snow shine. I'm making everything around it much darker. So this is what I was talking about before, by following how the land is actually going. So there's a slope up as this mountain climbs up in elevation. And I can actually see the lines of the slope in the picture. So I'm just painting that exact shape, following the direction that it's actually going in real life. Hopefully that makes sense. So whenever I am putting more middle value shapes, or whenever I'm extending the middle value shape, painting more of it, I first touch the paint into a spot that's already wet, and that creates that gradient and that flow and that blending within that shape. And there, see, that's why I let the sky dry before I got to paint this part, and that's why I started at the bottom and worked up, because you've got that really sharp edge at the top of the mountain. And I'm really taking my time with this part because I want to accurately portray the shape of these mountains. Usually I wouldn't be so concerned with the details, but in this case I want to get it right, so I'm going slow. I'm still trying to stay loose though. To paint loosely, Doesn't necessarily mean to paint fast. I've actually found that it helps me paint more loose if I go slower, because I can be more deliberate with how I'm being loose. Yeah, see, I think it's already starting to look more like snow than it did. That's great. Sometimes I'm not sure if things are actually going to work out when I paint. It's always a leap into the unknown, no matter how experienced you are. Sometimes watercolor just is going to do what it wants to do. That's also what makes it so fun. You never know what's going to happen. You might accidentally discover a new technique that you didn't know about, and there's just so many ways to paint it. So many different styles, so many different approaches. And now I'm adding in some of the darker areas, darker than middle value. You can see how much this is making the snow pop out. I think it reads pretty well. Just adding a little texture to that. I'll darken those areas later when they're drier, because I just painted that. So I'm going down. I went up and now I'm going back down. Just kind of following the driest areas. So I'm just adding in some more subtle texture to the mountain, giving it a little more shape. Just here and there, trying not to go crazy. It's very easy to overwork in this stage when you're adding the darker colors. It helps to kind of take a step back every once in a while and get a view for the whole thing, because you can get so hyper focused on whatever area it is that you're painting at the time. Yeah, I'm actually painting I'm painting into some of the wet areas now as it goes up the mountain. Now that's a little more dry, but not completely, because that will make the edges more indistinct and push all of this back into the distance. So indistinct fuzzy edges combined with more blue makes this farther away than this, farther away than this, farther away than this. Man, these mountains have such an interesting personality. Almost like something from another planet. But nope, it's this planet. There's some of that dry brushing technique right there. That's a really easy way to add texture. I also use it for painting trees quite a bit. Alright, I'm getting down towards the bottom now. Basically all I've been doing so far is just adding texture and darkening everything up and painting around lighter areas of rock and then going darker around the snow. Yeah, I think it's looking pretty good. So I'm just going to continue doing that all the way to the bottom, just adding textures, darkening things. I'm going to do a scratching technique for this grass right here. I'll show you that when I get to it. I'll see you there. I will also mention that I'm getting darker as I get to the foreground. So I'm just adding a tiny bit of texture to these closer snowbanks, just with a little bit of this blue-gray color, very, very light. I'm using this paper towel to wipe some of the excess paint off. I want it to be very, very, very subtle. Even though it's an overcast sky, there is still a little bit of shadows going on in these snowbanks. And that makes it look even more like snow, I think. I might even do a little bit of that for the farther ones too. Just a little. Just add a little variation in the color, yeah. Dim down the farther away ones. Push them back a little bit. Yeah, just like that. We're getting pretty close to the end here. Just a little dry brush there. So I'm going to do a scratching technique with the edge of my fingernail to give the texture of this grass. We'll see if it's dry enough. Yeah. So I'm just scratching and moving up. And I'm kind of changing the angle of my finger like that as I go, like that kind of motion. And that really does a good job at doing grass. Those little lighter blades sticking up, this just gives a very, very subtle texture. But the thing is, you would notice if it wasn't there. It wouldn't look like grass, it would look like stone or something else. And same thing down here, just a little bit. And my nail is actually dragging up a little of that dark paint over the snow. So you see the grass peeking up from behind the snowbank. Now, just around here, just a few random marks. These teeny tiny little details make all of the difference, all of it. That is the difference between a good painting and a great painting. Just wanted to darken that up a little bit. So I'm gonna stand back and look at this. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. I am gonna add a little texture in here. So I'm taking my brush and I'm just splaying the ends out so that it looks like that. And that lets me add these kind of jaggedy random textures, slightly tapping like that. Just subtle variation. Okay. I need to darken this house or whatever this structure is. You can see that bloom still there underneath the darker layers. And this darker red is going to bloom once again, I think. Just a little bit at the edge. Yeah, that's perfect. Wow, that really pops out. That's awesome. That looks really cool. Okay, I'm gonna just throw a little gray on there for that roof. Now I need to wait for this to dry a little more, and I'm gonna add some final details in gouache just on that house. Maybe I will lighten up a few areas of snow, just a little bit. Maybe just in the foreground. So I'm gonna let this dry and I'll see you in a minute. So I've got this tube of titanium white artist gouache. I've had it for like 3 years because I just use it for little highlights at the very end if needed. Sometimes it's not needed. So I just take it straight out of the tube. Now gouache is opaque watercolor, so you can paint on top of dark, which is a lot harder to do with regular watercolor. So I'm just kind of dipping the brush into it, making sure it's even. I'm gonna dip it into a little bit of water and then just roll it out here, more water. This little tiny bit of gouache here will honestly be most of what I need. A little really goes a long way with gouache. Okay. Add a little gray to it, just a little bit. I don't want it to be pure white. And I'm just gonna add some highlights to these snowbanks, and then it will really, really look like snow. So this is serving two purposes. It's adding highlights and texture. There are many artists that do their entire paintings in gouache, like James Gurney is well known for doing that. I've never tried that. Might be something I get into at some point. Now gouache is weird in that it dries darker than when you put it on, which is the opposite of watercolor. I'm not sure the reason why that is. It might be something to do with the fact that there's much more pigment in gouache than there is with watercolor. Not sure though. Yeah, we're almost done here. Just about done. Yeah, so if you found that you accidentally painted over an area that you wanted to keep as a highlight, you can always go back and add it in with gouache. Watercolor is definitely one of the more unforgiving mediums, but there are certain things you can get away with, and this is one of them. 'Cause I think I actually made a lot of these snowbanks too dark, but it's really hard to tell without anything else around it how light or dark it's going to be in a scene like this. At least I struggle with it, but I think this is looking amazingly good. I'm very, very happy with this painting. I was honestly intimidated by it because it's just such an epic scene. I can also use these little patches of snow to indicate shape and direction, because the snow will often stay snow down in the crevices where there's less sunlight reaching it, and so they kind of trace out lines, topographic lines on the mountainside. And it really is just so much fun to paint these. I love painting these. It's super satisfying. It really just makes it all perfectly come together. Just adding in some of the more subtle shapes that I wasn't able to paint around because they were just too intricate. Can't paint around everything. That's why we have gouache. Yeah, see how that kind of motion with the white gives the indication of a valley up here. Again, with that motion, following the actual slope of the terrain with your hand as you're painting. See, these snowbanks are at an angle because they're on the side of this canyon or ravine. Yeah, I think I'm calling it. I'm done. Just gotta throw my signature on there and we'll be done. Almost. Glad I remembered this. Last touch, final touch. There we have it. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Hopefully I'll see you on the next one.